Good evening, friends. Today is August 6th, 2022, and it is this day 77 years ago that an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a bomb that virtually in seconds obliterated nearly an entire city. And 3 days later, a second bomb would be dropped by the Americans on Nagasaki with much the same consequences. Now, in previous years, I have written briefly on these atomic bombings and on what we might briefly think about as the meaning of Hiroshima. And over the years, I've had an opportunity to read a bit more on the literature, and I've been gathering notes for what eventually I hope will be a book on Hiroshima. And in thinking about this subject, I have turned to a great many books that I wasn't aware of when I had written my pieces in 2015, including, for example, this huge study, which is really the most important document for the study of Hiroshima. The book is called Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Physical, Medical, and Social Effects of the Atomic Bombings. And it is published by the Committee for the Compilation of Materials on Damage Caused by the Atomic Bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the book actually opens with a series of photographs, including the first known photographs of the bombing, a couple of which were actually taken by a Japanese schoolboy. Many of these photographs were not really reproduced widely until quite recently. And one of the things that the book tells us is that there was actually just a couple of weeks after the two bombings, a fairly extensive amount of video footage that was taken. And for various reasons that the book gets into, this footage was never made public, either by the Americans or by the Japanese, who weren't aware of much of that footage because it was initially sent to the Americans, who then stored it away, partially because what the footage offered was irrefutable evidence of the fact that the radiation emanating from the bombing was continuing to cause deaths weeks after the bombings had started. So some of this footage goes back to about 2 or 3 weeks after the bombing, and then some of it was put together in the next subsequent weeks. But anyhow, my set of reflections today, which is the first set of reflections, because I hope to do a more extensive series of talks. I say I hope because there have been previous occasions when I've thought that I would do a series of talks and haven't. But in this case, I have been reading up on Hiroshima and Nagasaki for, as I said, several years, and a great many thoughts come to mind. And I just want to, in a sense, give an overview of some of the kinds of things that we might want to think about. For example, why were Hiroshima and Nagasaki targeted? How did the Americans pick upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Did they make a list of targets? Did they then reject certain targets? Were these cities picked because of their military importance? Right? And so on. So there's a whole set of questions which have to do with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, why they were picked. Of course, then there's a whole set of questions which this particular book that I have shared with you gets into, and that is the effects of the bombing. Now, all of that has been studied, it seems to me, very extensively, particularly in Japanese, but also by Western scholars. There's a huge amount of documentation about the effects of the bombing, the effects of radiation, what kind of damage was caused to the landscape. I used the word in my introductory remarks, obliterated. And so therefore, some of you, having heard that word, might think that, well, did anything actually remain? And of course, then the question is, well, how far are we talking about the epicenter? How far are we talking from ground zero when we talk about buildings remaining? And the further you go away from ground zero or the epicenter, obviously the damage was less. Right? But if you're looking at a radius within 2 kilometers of the epicenter, nearly everything was completely leveled. Nearly everything was completely leveled. Then there's a whole set of questions, and I would say that this has been the largest subject of the debate in the United States. A whole set of questions about why was the bombing undertaken? And it is necessary to say that for a very long period of time in the United States, there really was no debate about this question. In other words, the justification that had been offered, and this is the justification that we will need to probe further, but the justification that was offered was that this was the most expeditious way to end the war with a minimum loss of lives, both on the American side and the Japanese side. Whether the Americans were actually concerned about the loss of life on the Japanese side is actually, in my judgment, an open question. And one of the reasons it is because, and this is the third set of questions then, is because we have to ask, what was the nature of the profound racism that was perhaps behind the atomic bombing of 2 Japanese cities? Let us not forget that there was no atomic bombing of the Germans. And of course, someone who's thinking about this for a moment might say, well, that's an absurd argument because Germany had unconditionally surrendered in any case, right? And I'm using the phrase unconditionally surrendered because there was no demand for an unconditional surrender against Germany as it was against Japan. The Allied forces moved in, the Soviet Union and the United States moved into Berlin. The Soviets were there first. And we know that Hitler and a good number of people, by no stretch of the imagination, the entire German leadership, of course not, because many of them were then brought to trial at the Nuremberg War trials, but a good number of the people in the top tiers of the German leadership, the Nazi leadership, committed suicide. And that was the end of the war in Europe. Right? But in the case of Japan, the United States insisted upon an unconditional surrender of the Japanese. And the key thing to understand here, and this is something that I'll take up later on in one of the subsequent talks in a little bit more detail, the key thing to understand here is an unconditional surrender meant exactly what the word unconditional stipulates. That is that the Japanese could not ask for anything. It wasn't given to them to, of course, impose any demand or impose a request, but it wasn't open them to really to ask anything. And they did ask for something, and that was the whole ruckus over the unconditional surrender. And what they asked for was that the office of the emperor, the institution of the emperor, would not be touched. And this is something that the Americans were not willing to grant. Let it be said at the outset that when the Americans and the Allied forces undertook the trials of war criminals, Japanese war criminals, the emperor was not included. The emperor was exempted. Right? And of course, there's a considerable amount of discussion about the culpability of the emperor of Hirohito. But again, this is not something that we need be detained by. It's simply here, this is going back to the whole question of Why is it that the Americans undertook this decision to bomb these cities in Japan? How does one understand this decision? What might have been the nature of racism that in some ways formed the backdrop of that decision? And it is in anticipation of the rejoinders to that that I'm suggesting that, yes, of course, as we will see, the atomic bomb project started not in response to Japan, because Japan never had a bomb. And in fact, the Americans were confident that the Japanese did not have the military and scientific capacity, to build a bomb. And they were correct about that. But the Americans had received intimation that the Germans were at work on a bomb. We know that a great many of the scientists who actually worked on the Manhattan Project, as it was called, the project that led to the development of the atomic bombs, that a substantial number of these scientists were in fact of German origin. And some of these scientists had fled, of course, Germany and had come to the United States. But they were scientists back in Germany who were working on the bomb. But it is also very clear that by 1942, the Americans were also in possession of information which indicated that the Germans really were not in the race any longer, that they simply didn't have the capacity to do this, and they didn't have the scientific wherewithal at that point in time to be able to build a bomb. But this is, again, something that is all under discussion, which is simply a way of saying that the fact that the Americans continued with the Manhattan Project, even after, keep that in mind, even after Germany had surrendered, the war was over, meant that the Americans now really were seriously thinking of using the bomb against the Japanese. Right? So I've described now three sets of questions, one having to do with why did Americans decide that they were going to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Or rather, just let's put it in a more general form, why did they decide that they were going to actually use the bomb against Japan? Secondly, why is it they targeted these particular cities? How did they come to that decision? How does one understand that decision? What are its implications? Right? And then I have also referred to what I have described as the whole question of racism, whether this bomb was, so to speak, really reserved for a race that the Americans considered to be an inferior race. I think there's a very substantial body of scholarly work which suggests that this was a factor that unquestionably has to be taken into consideration when one is looking at the whole politics of the atomic bombings. Right? Then there's a set of questions which have to do with President Truman. As we know, Truman inherited the presidency. He inherited the presidency because he was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR's vice president, when FDR was in his fourth term. Unprecedented, of course, in American history. FDR was in his fourth term, and he was, it is safe to say, almost venerated in the United States at that time. Right? He had steered the country through the war, and had, of course, already led the country to a military triumph against the Nazis, and the Americans were now on the verge of annihilating the Japanese. But before he could taste the fruits of that victory, Roosevelt died in office. In April 1945, Truman was his vice president at that time, and he became the president of the United States, a man that nearly all the scholarship agrees upon this, most ill-fitted to serve as president of the United States. There's also some psychoanalytic work that has been done on Truman, which I think is interesting and which I think has some bearing on the question of how one understands Truman's decision, because it was Truman's decision to actually drop the bomb on Hiroshima. It is on 25th July 1945 that he signed the order authorizing the dropping of the bomb. It is also important to mention something that is very little understood and is almost never mentioned in most of the books that have been written on the subject. But the second bomb was not, in fact, actually dropped with the explicit authorization of President Truman, because Truman had left this matter to his generals. And it is after the second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki on 9th August. And then the Japanese indicated within hours, in less than 24 hours, when they communicated that they were willing to surrender on August 10th. The surrender actually didn't come about until some days later on, because there was still negotiation going on about the whole question of unconditional surrender, right? But on August 10th, the Japanese communicated that they were now willing to surrender. And at that point, Truman issued an order stating that no further bomb was to be dropped without his explicit authorization and written order. I myself was under the belief that the Americans only had 2 bombs. But the research has clearly established that there was a third bomb which would not be available to the Americans until approximately August 19th. Some say perhaps a couple of days earlier. So let's keep in mind the chronology. That the first bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, the second on August 9th. And then the Americans had a third bomb, which they could have used perhaps as early as maybe the 16th, 17th, or 18th of August, but certainly by the 19th. And Truman was informed that there was a fourth bomb, but that would only be available in September. Because even as late as August 12th, Truman is talking to his advisors and saying that it looks inevitable that we are now going to have to drop a bomb on Tokyo. And this is because of the discussions that were still going on between the Japanese and the Americans on the conditions of surrender. And let me reiterate once again that the only condition that we're talking about that the Japanese were trying to impose on the Americans, so to speak, right? Requesting them, and that condition had to do with the preservation of the institution of the emperor, right? Which was to the Japanese completely sacrosanct. Right? But there's a very interesting set of questions which have to do with Truman coming out of really obscurity in a way. I'm overstating it, of course, because he was a vice president. He was a senator in the United States Congress before that. But there's a very interesting anecdote which I think reveals something to us about how Truman was viewed, right? It is on the early afternoon of April 12, 1945, that Truman received a call saying that he was required urgently at the White House, really urgently at the White House. And when he arrived at the White House, he was taken to the private quarters of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the news was broken to him that, and she said, and this was apparently the conversation, she said, the president is dead. She didn't say my husband because she's speaking to him almost in an official capacity. Right? The president is dead. And we are told that Truman then offered his condolences and said to Mrs. Roosevelt, can I be of any help? And she replied, is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now, end quote. And of course, this was a comment which was meant to indicate that she knew, as everyone else did, that Truman was woefully underprepared for the office, the august office of the presidency of the United States in wartime. Right? So this is a very interesting set of questions about Truman, who he was, why he decided to go ahead with the bombing, what his own background tells us about the man, and whether, as I've suggested, a psychoanalytic reading of Truman might actually be useful. Then there's a whole set of questions about who was the intended audience of the atomic bombings. And I think generations of school children in the United States have been told only one thing in all their textbooks. And what they've been told is the atomic bombings were absolutely necessary. They were necessary because Japan was not surrendering. And if Japan didn't surrender, the United States would have to go in for a bloody invasion, land invasion. And that this invasion was likely to lead to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. And so therefore, the 100,000 lives that were lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki each, I'm just rounding out the figures, right? In Hiroshima, within an hour, approximately 100,000 people were dead. 50,000 people are thought to have died instantly, the moment the bomb detonated. And then within 1 hour, another 50,000 are said to have died. Some people have given different figures, but that's roughly what we're talking about. And we're talking about us approximately the same, for the sake of argument, number of people killed in Nagasaki. I'm not including here the number of people who were killed over a longer period of time as a consequence of the radiation from the bombing, right? But this is what American school children have been told, that this is why the bomb was dropped. It was dropped almost as a humanitarian gesture, not just to save our lives, the lives of our soldiers, American soldiers, but to save the lives of the Japanese. Right? So this was, of course, the good war. And the generation that fought it is called in the United States the greatest generation. Right? But who really was the target? Was it only the Japanese? And we discover lots of things when we start delving into the literature. One of the things that we discover, for example, is that the supreme commander of the Allied forces, General MacArthur, was not even aware of the existence of the bomb until 48 hours before the Hiroshima bombing. And then when he heard of the existence of this bomb, he was absolutely horrified, because he said, the Japanese have already lost. They're about to surrender. Why are we even thinking about this bomb, right? He held firmly to the view that it was completely unnecessary. Right? And all the reports indicate that when the bomb was dropped on August 6th, and he got the news of it, he was absolutely livid. Right? What General MacArthur also, I think, understood very well, and scholars have now, over the years, begun to understand. There were, of course, people who knew that back then. That is, the people who were actually engaged in it, because they knew who they were targeting. But what scholars have begun to understand is that this bomb was a warning to the Soviet Union. And of course, we have to understand the irony of all of this, because the Potsdam Declaration was issued in the name of Harry Truman, President of the United States, Clement Attlee, who had succeeded Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He had just succeeded him, just like Harry Truman had succeeded FDR, and Joseph Stalin, right? The head of the Communist Party and the dictator of the Soviet Union. It was issued in their names, this declaration. Right? And yet, even as this declaration was issued, it was already clear. It was there on the horizon. There was no mistaking it. The fact that the United States was already at war with the Soviet Union. The Cold War had started before anyone was talking about the Cold War. It had started because the Americans knew that the minute this war was over, they were now going to have to direct their attention to the threat of communism. And I think there is no question whatsoever that this bomb was sent as a warning to the Soviets. This is what we have. Know this, be aware of it, and think before you think about meddling with our ambitions and with our power anywhere in the world. Right? So when we are doing a history of Hiroshima, I think a great deal is involved here, including things that I haven't, of course, even mentioned, which I hope to do in the course of the next brief talks. For example, the whole idea of experimentation, that they wanted to experiment with this new toy that they have. Some people described it as a toy back then. Right? We have to understand the larger geopolitics of this. We have to understand the racism behind it. We have to understand the ethical implications of using the bomb. Why is it that this atomic bombing takes us to a different threshold? And I will begin with this question in part 2 of this set of talks on the significance of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what we might describe as a cultural, social, political histories of the atomic bombings.